For 60 years, an Ethiopian monk refused to speak about what was written in the manuscript he guarded, a text his own church has never allowed outside scholars to fully examine. Then, on the last night of his life, he broke that silence and told two younger monks what Jesus Christ reportedly said after the resurrection. During the 40 days, most Western Bibles compress into a single paragraph. What he said next is the reason this video is going to make some people deeply uncomfortable. Subscribe now and stay to the end, because the third teaching is the one his own tradition spent 2,000 years trying to keep buried. Here is something almost nobody raised in a Western church has ever been told. Your Bible is not the whole Bible. When church leaders met in the 4th century and decided which books belonged in Scripture and which ones didn't, the version that reached most of the world was trimmed down to 66 books. But one church never accepted that trim. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church, tucked into the highlands of East Africa, kept 81. Ethiopia's monasteries are not ordinary buildings. Some are carved into the tops of cliffs so steep that monks have to be hauled up on leather ropes, the only way in or out. Ge'ez, the ancient liturgical language used inside these walls, is a script so old that tradition holds it's the language angels themselves speak. Manuscripts here have survived wars, colonization attempts, and 1,000 years of isolation, untouched by the councils that reshaped Christianity everywhere else. Inside one of these cliffside monasteries, a monk spent 6 decades guarding a single handwritten volume. Local tradition names him Abba Tekla. For 60 years, the story goes, he read from that manuscript every single day and never once spoke its contents aloud to anyone who wasn't already bound by the same vows he was. So what was actually written on those pages? And why would a man guard something for 60 years only to whisper it out loud with his very last breath? To understand why that silence mattered, you have to understand how these monasteries actually function. A place like Debri Damo isn't reached by road. There's no staircase, no path winding gently up the rock face. The only way in is a plaited leather rope lowered from above by a monk waiting at the top, and the only way anyone gets up is by trusting a stranger with their life. Women have never been permitted to set foot on the summit, not out of ordinary custom, but because tradition holds the site was consecrated in a way that makes it off-limits to them entirely. Even livestock brought up for the monks' use are by long practice only male. That isolation is exactly the point. For over 1,000 years, whatever sat inside those walls sat there undisturbed. No foreign bishop revising it, no invading army burning it, no printing press flattening it into a mass-produced edition, stripped of whatever made it dangerous in the first place. While cathedrals in Europe were being built, torn down, and rebuilt across centuries of war and schism, a handful of Ethiopian monasteries just kept doing what they'd always done: copying, guarding, waiting. The man and the manuscript. Local tradition names the dying monk Abba Tekla. He entered monastic life as a young man, and by his own account to the 2 disciples with him that night, began reading this specific manuscript daily, starting at age 31, a practice he kept unbroken for the next 6 decades. The manuscript itself is written on vellum, in Ge'ez, using iron gall ink, a formula of iron salts and tannin-rich gall nuts that Ethiopian scribes have used for well over 1,000 years because it bonds permanently into the fiber of the page rather than sitting on top of it. It's part of why some Ethiopian manuscripts have survived in usable condition for centuries longer than comparable European texts written in less stable inks. Tradition holds that this specific volume, sometimes referred to as the Mashafa Kedus or Book of the Covenant, in the oral memory of the monastery, is one of only a small number of copies believed to have ever existed. Not because the original text was rare when it was first composed, but because, according to the tradition guarding it, nearly every other copy was destroyed, lost to fire and war, or simply never permitted to leave the monastery walls that held it. For 60 years, Abba Tekla never quoted from it publicly, not in a sermon, not to visiting pilgrims, not even to the disciples who shared his daily prayers. That night, with his health failing and his breathing labored, he decided the reasons for that silence no longer applied. What the West never got, open a Western Bible and turn to the story of the resurrection. Jesus rises. He appears to his followers. 40 days pass. Then he ascends into heaven. 40 days. That's the single most important stretch of time in the entire Christian story. The window where a man who was crucified and buried supposedly walked among his closest followers again. And in most Western Gospels, it's summarized in a handful of verses, a blessing, an ascension, almost nothing in between. According to what the old man begins reciting that night, the version preserved in this manuscript fills that gap, not with comfort, with warning. The risen Christ, in this account, doesn't come back to reassure his disciples that everything will be fine. He comes back like someone pulling people aside moments before disaster, urgent, direct, running out of time. And the very first thing he reportedly says is this: "Do not build temples of stone, for stone crumbles. Build the temple of the heart, because that is the only temple that lasts. Sit with that for a second. That's not a gentle spiritual metaphor. That's a warning aimed directly at the very structures that would later be built in his name. The gold-covered altars, the fortified cathedrals, the wars fought under his banner." The account goes further. It describes a prediction. Powerful men, wrapped in fine robes, using his name to gather wealth. An empire, centuries later, seizing the cross itself and turning it into a weapon, launching crusades, running inquisitions, funding grand buildings on the backs of people who had almost nothing. If a text like that existed intact, and if it had somehow been copied and spread across the Roman world in the centuries after Christ, it's not hard to imagine why it would have made powerful men extremely nervous. Think about the timeline here. Within 300 years of the crucifixion, Christianity went from a persecuted minority faith to the official religion of the most powerful empire on earth. That's not a small shift. That's a complete reversal of fortune. And reversals like that rarely happen without compromise. Somewhere in that transition, a faith built by fishermen and outcasts became a faith administered by senators, tax collectors, and imperial bureaucrats. Men who understood how institutions accumulate power, and who had every incentive to shape the surviving texts into something that reinforced their own authority rather than undermined it. The account guarded on this mountain doesn't describe that shift kindly. It describes it as the exact outcome Christ warned his closest followers to watch for, a faith built to liberate people, quietly repurposed into a faith built to manage them. And the old man, reciting this from memory, with his eyes barely able to focus anymore, tells his disciples that every gold-plated altar he's ever heard described, every war fought under a cross, every excommunication used to silence a dissenting voice, traces back to the same warning Christ is said to have given in those first hours after the resurrection. But that first teaching, as unsettling as it is not the one the monastery has always considered the most dangerous. That one comes next. The diagnosis. The second teaching goes further than the first, into territory the manuscript treats almost clinically. Every human being, he says, carries two winds moving through them at all times. One is the wind of life. The other is the wind of error. And here's the part that stops both disciples cold. The wind of error isn't described as some abstract concept of sin. It's described almost clinically, like a diagnosis. It has entry points. It gets in through greed. It gets in through the eyes, when they linger where they shouldn't. It gets in through the mouth, every time it shapes a lie. And once it's in, the text says, it doesn't just make a person a little worse. It hardens something, calcifies it. Given enough time, a person can end up going through all the motions of being alive, waking, eating, working, sleeping, waking again, while the part of them that actually feels anything has already gone cold. The manuscript has a name for that state, a walking tomb. That image alone has apparently been sitting in this cliffside monastery for 2,000 years, known to almost no one outside its walls. But after the diagnosis comes the cure. And this is where it gets genuinely radical for its time. The antidote isn't a ritual. It isn't a sacrament performed by a priest. It isn't membership in any church at all. The text calls it knowledge, direct, personal, unmediated knowledge of the truth, available to anyone willing to look inward. Disciples are taught to watch their own thoughts the way a guard watches a city gate, paying attention to what enters and what tries to leave. And then comes the line the old man repeats twice, like he needs his disciples to understand he means it literally, not poetically. The kingdom of heaven is inside the human body, hidden in the silence between one thought and the next. Think about what that would have meant to an ordinary person living under Roman rule 2,000 years ago. If people truly believed the divine was already inside them, freely accessible, requiring no priest, no temple tax, no fear of being cast out, they would have had very little reason left to need the religious machinery built up around them. That's not a small idea. That's the kind of idea that makes entire institutions structurally unnecessary. And that, according to 60 years of guarded silence on this mountain, is exactly why a teaching like that had almost no chance of surviving in the wider world. There's a further detail buried in this section of the manuscript that the old man dwells on longer than almost anything else that night. The text apparently describes the wind of error not as something that arrives once and stays forever, but as something that has to be continually resisted, moment by moment, thought by thought. There's no single ritual that permanently cleanses a person. There's no purchase, no offering, no one-time event that locks in salvation and lets a person stop paying attention. The work, according to this teaching, is constant. A daily discipline of noticing where the mind drifts and gently pulling it back. That idea alone would have unsettled a lot of religious authority structures built around the opposite premise. The idea that forgiveness, favor, or salvation could be dispensed by an institution on its terms at a price it's set. If the real work happens quietly, inside a person's own mind, with no one else able to verify it, charge for it, or grant it, then there's very little left for a priesthood to actually control. The warning. The third teaching is the one the monastery has always protected most carefully of all, not because it's the most mystical, but because it's the most dangerous to say out loud. In this account, The risen Christ looks at the men who just watched him die and somehow stand in front of them again, and he tells them plainly, "Darkness is coming, and it will wear my face." Not an obvious villain arriving in the night, not a monster anyone could recognize on sight. A deception so carefully built that it would look exactly like him. It would speak his name. It would carry his symbol. It would raise buildings in his honor and inscribe his own words on the inside covers of texts used to control the very people he came to free. In other words, according to the tradition guarded on this mountain, the danger Christ warned about was never a single future tyrant. It was a system, an institution wearing the costume of the very man it had quietly betrayed. And the monks who kept this manuscript alive for 2 millennia have apparently believed, generation after generation, that this passage wasn't a prophecy about something still to come. It was a description of something that had already arrived, a long, long time ago. What makes this teaching so uncomfortable isn't just the idea of a disguised threat. It's the specificity of how the text describes recognizing it. According to the tradition passed down through this monastery, the deception wouldn't announce itself through cruelty or obvious corruption. It would announce itself through comfort, through beautiful buildings, reassuring rituals, and leaders who spoke with total confidence about things no human being could actually know for certain. The text reportedly warns that the safest feeling version of faith is often the one worth questioning hardest, because ease and certainty are exactly the qualities a counterfeit would need to spread quickly and unopposed. That's a hard teaching to sit with, even now. It doesn't offer a villain to point at. It doesn't name a single group, a single century, or a single betrayer. It asks each person individually to keep checking their own footing, to keep asking whether the comfort they feel inside a familiar structure is coming from truth or simply from familiarity. That question is exactly why this teaching was the one Abba Tekla waited until his final hour to say out loud. The outside witness. Here's where the story steps briefly outside the monastery and into the world of academic record, because this part isn't legend at all. In the late 1990s, a French ethnologist named Jacques Mercier, affiliated for decades with France's National Center for Scientific Research, was entrusted by Ethiopian authorities to help authenticate the Garima Gospels, a pair of illustrated Christian manuscripts housed in another remote Ethiopian monastery. Radiocarbon dating later placed those manuscripts somewhere between the years 330 and 650. That makes them among the oldest surviving illustrated Christian manuscripts anywhere on Earth, older than nearly anything preserved in Europe from that same period. While large parts of Europe moved through centuries of instability, isolated Ethiopian monasteries, sealed inside cliffs and gorges, kept copying, kept preserving, largely undisturbed by the political and doctrinal battles reshaping Christianity elsewhere. The manuscript at the center of tonight's story has never received that kind of formal international study. It exists mostly in the oral memory and guarded practice of a small number of monasteries, which is exactly why almost no one outside Ethiopia has ever heard the 3 teachings you're hearing tonight. Scholars who've spent time around Ethiopia's monastic manuscript tradition tend to describe a similar first reaction, a kind of disorientation, the sense that something they assumed was settled and fixed turns out to have alternate versions nobody told them about. It's one thing to know abstractly that other Christian traditions exist. It's another to sit in a stone room holding vellum older than the version of the story you grew up believing was the only one that survived. That gap between what most of the world was taught and what a handful of cliffside monasteries quietly kept intact is really the entire premise of tonight's story. But the manuscript tradition isn't the deepest layer of what this mountain range is said to be protecting, because Ethiopia has made one claim for 3,000 years that goes even further than a lost gospel: the Ark, Aksum, and Adwa. According to Ethiopia's royal chronicle, the Kebra Nagast, the Ark of the Covenant isn't lost. It isn't a myth, a metaphor, or a mystery for archaeologists to chase. Ethiopian tradition holds that it sits right now inside a chapel in the ancient city of Aksum under permanent guard. The story, as the chronicle tells it, begins with the Queen of Sheba traveling to Jerusalem to meet King Solomon. She returns home carrying his son, a boy who would grow up to become Menelik I. Years later, an adult Menelik travels back to visit his father. Solomon offers him the throne of Israel itself. Menelik declines, but according to the legend, he and his companions don't leave empty-handed. They're said to have carried the original ark back to Ethiopia, leaving a replica behind in Jerusalem. Only one person is ever allowed to guard it at a time. Once chosen, tradition holds, he enters the chapel and never leaves it again for the rest of his life. Now, none of this can be independently verified. The chapel is sealed to outsiders, and no scholar has been permitted to examine what's inside. But two things about Ethiopia's history are very real and very well documented. First, the Knights Templar are recorded as having traveled into Ethiopia in the 12th century, and their carved symbols still exist today inside the rock churches of Lalibela. Whatever they were looking for, they went home without it. Second, Ethiopia is the only nation on the African continent that was never successfully colonized. When Italy invaded in 1896, with modern European weaponry and the full backing of an empire, Ethiopian forces defeated them decisively at the Battle of Adwa, a victory that stunned colonial powers across the continent and became a symbol of African independence that still resonates today. And then there's Lalibela itself. 11 churches, according to tradition, built under King Lalibela, are not constructed buildings at all. They're carved straight down into solid volcanic rock, entire cathedrals, complete with windows, columns, interior chambers, and working drainage systems, all excavated from single, continuous pieces of stone. There's no room for error in a technique like that. Every measurement, every structural decision had to exist correctly in someone's mind before a single tool ever touched the rock. Modern engineers who've studied the site have estimated that carving all 11 churches with 12th century tools would have realistically required tens of thousands of workers laboring continuously for well over 100 years. Yet local tradition places the project inside a window of roughly 24 years, and the volume of stone removed to create those churches, enormous by any estimate, has never been located anywhere nearby. No quarry pile, no debris field, nothing that accounts for where millions of tons of rock actually went. The monks who maintain these churches offer their own explanation, one that's been passed down for generations. Human laborers worked by day, and something else, described only as light passing through stone without resistance, continued the work after dark. Make of that what you will, but the churches are there. The stone is not, and that mystery has never been fully resolved. Beneath the most famous of the 11, the Church of St. George, carved as a perfect cross, sunk straight down into the earth until its roof sits level with the surrounding ground, runs a network of pitch-black tunnels. Candidates preparing for the priesthood are sent into them alone, without light, navigating entirely by touch and sound while chanting to keep themselves oriented in the dark. It's not hard to see the symbolism there, deliberate or not. You pass through total darkness before you're given access to the light above. Recent three-dimensional laser scans of the site reportedly revealed hollow chambers beneath several of the churches, spaces that haven't been opened in centuries. Local priests describe them as a kind of treasury, said to contain manuscripts, ceremonial objects, and possibly tools connected to the original construction. No outside researcher has been granted permission to open them, and it's unclear if that will ever change. As for the chapel at Axum said to house the Ark itself, visitors over the generations have described a strange, consistent pattern among the line of solitary guardians who've served there. Vision that fails earlier than it should. Skin that pales over long years spent almost entirely indoors. Guardians who don't live as long as their peers outside the chapel walls. None of that proves anything on its own, but it's the kind of detail that keeps showing up in the historical record again and again, generation after generation, and nobody inside or outside the tradition has ever offered a fully satisfying explanation for why. The bloodline and the timing. Here's another detail Western Christianity rarely engages with at all, the question of Jesus' family line. In most Western traditions, that question simply doesn't come up. The story ends at the cross and resumes in heaven, full stop. In Ethiopia, that silence would be almost unthinkable. Ethiopia's Solomonic dynasty is recorded as ruling for nearly 3,000 years, from roughly 900 BC all the way until 1974, one continuous royal line. The last emperor, Haile Selassie, held the formal title Conquering Lion of the Tribe of Judah, not a poetic flourish, but a genealogical claim, tracing his lineage directly back to King David. If that claim holds any weight, then Ethiopia's royal history and the biblical line running through Mary, traditionally described as being of the house of David, share the same root. That would make the connection between Ethiopia and the story of Jesus something closer to family than theology. Genetic research adds an unexpected layer here. Studies of Ethiopian populations have identified ancient genetic markers tracing back to the Levant, the region covering modern Israel and Syria, dating to roughly 3,000 years ago. Real migration, not folklore. It also explains why Ethiopian Christianity looks noticeably different from its Western counterparts. The Saturday Sabbath is still observed. Circumcision on the 8th day is still practiced. Detailed dietary laws drawn from Leviticus are still followed. This isn't a church that borrowed from Judaism. It's a church that never fully separated from it. Which brings the old man in his final minutes to the idea his disciples find hardest to sit with. If certain ancient traditions are right, and Christ survived far longer than most accounts suggest, where would he have gone to disappear safely beyond Rome's reach, protected by people who would ask no questions? A kingdom ruled by his own family line is not a bad answer. In the remote highlands, oral tradition speaks of a traveling healer who arrived from the north generations after the crucifixion, a teacher unlike anyone the local people had encountered. They never called him Jesus. They called him the righteous teacher. No outside historian has ever been able to explain who that figure actually was. And there's a reason the old man tells his disciples that all of this is surfacing now, tonight, after 60 years of silence. The manuscript describes the conditions of a coming age, using a Ge'ez phrase that translates roughly as webs of illusion, a world that appears deeply connected while being fundamentally hollow, where people speak without real voices, see without real eyes, and where manufactured images quietly replace lived experience. Whether or not you find that description compelling, it's hard to deny how closely it lines up with a world built on screens, algorithms, and constant digital noise. The monks, according to this tradition, weren't simply preserving old scripture out of habit. They believed they were holding a message meant to be opened only when the world finally matched its description. Trust in institutions collapsing. People searching for something real and finding mostly noise. And on this particular night, in this particular cell, the old man decides that moment has finally arrived. There's a phrase repeated at several points across the manuscript, according to the old man's recitation, that describes the removal of certain texts from the wider Christian canon, not as an act of historical caution, but as what he calls a targeted disarmament. Books that framed ordinary people as spiritually capable on their own, without needing a priest standing between them and the divine, were the ones least likely to survive the editing process. It isn't that every excluded text made this argument explicitly. It's that the ones that did tended not to make it into the final collection at all. Some passages near the end of the manuscript reportedly drift into territory that reads less like devotional writing and more like technical description, precise language about sound, vibration, and its effects on physical matter, the kind of imagery that centuries later people might associate with acoustics or resonance rather than mysticism. Whether that's meaningful or simply the way ancient authors described things they didn't have modern vocabulary for is impossible to say with any certainty, but it's one more layer in a tradition that keeps refusing to separate the spiritual from the physical as cleanly as most Western readers are used to. Abba Tekle tells his disciples the three teachings they've just heard aren't abstract theology. They're something closer to a survival kit, built, he says, for people exactly like the ones living through this moment in history. The first, don't put your faith in buildings and institutions because stone crumbles. Build something inward instead, something that can't be torn down. The second, stop looking outward for permission to encounter the divine. It isn't gate-kept behind an institution or a title. It's already inside you, in the quiet space between one thought and the next. The third, spoken last. The danger was never a monster you'd recognize on sight. It wears a familiar face. Don't mistake the costume for the man underneath it. Abba Tekle Haymanot dies that night at 3:40 in the morning, according to the account passed down by his disciples. For the first time in 60 years, the words he spent his whole life protecting are no longer sealed inside that room. If any one of those three teachings landed somewhere inside you tonight, tell me which one in the comments. The temple of the heart, the silence between your thoughts, or the warning about a familiar face hiding something else entirely. Subscribe now, because this old man didn't break 60 years of silence just to have his words scrolled past. There's more to this story than what we've covered tonight. And the next chapter goes somewhere most people aren't ready to follow. The West has the water, Ethiopia has the well, and after 2,000 years, that well is finally open.